the forest had a silence that didn't belong to nature. It was too still, too aware, as if every twisted root and blackened tree trunk was listening. The locals said no one should go past Miller's Creek after sundown, but curiosity has a way of killing more than cats. By the time she realized how deep she'd gone into those woods, the sun was already bleeding out behind the hills, and the smell of damp earth carried something older, something rotten. She found the cabin by accident, or maybe it found her. Its roof sagged like a tired body, its windows were empty eye sockets, and beneath its floorboards lay the secret that would rot her sleep forever. The first clue wasn't the bones, nor the smell of decay, it was a small Bible wrapped in linen, stained dark with time and something that wasn't water. Inside, every name repeated, circling back like snakes devouring their own tails. Elsie May. The name appeared more than once, daughter, sister, mother, all tied to one man's name that echoed across generations like a curse. The deeper she read, the heavier the air became. And somewhere in that forest, where the trees leaned in close enough to whisper, something was waiting. Something that had never stopped watching its own blood. The story begins with a young journalist named Claire Sutton, who had built her career chasing forgotten tragedies and local legends buried under time. Her latest assignment led her to the Appalachian backwoods, a stretch of land that seemed to breathe its own folklore. It was supposed to be a brief investigation into an abandoned property once owned by the Harrow family, whose name carried whispers of madness, disease, and something far worse. The townspeople spoke of them in half-sentences, never meeting her eyes, as if even mentioning them might call something out from the trees. On her third day of research, while exploring what remained of the family's collapsed homestead, Claire's boot struck something hard beneath a layer of blackened soil and leaves. She crouched down and brushed the earth aside, revealing the corner of a wooden box, its edges softened by moisture and rot. The box wasn't large, just enough to hold a few keepsakes, but something about the way it was buried beneath the cabin's remains made her hands tremble. It took her nearly an hour to pry it free, her palms slick with mud and splinters. When the lid creaked open, the stench of mildew and time flooded the air, and inside, she found an old family Bible wrapped in yellowed cloth. The cover was cracked, its leather curling, the gold lettering long faded. Still, it felt alive, as though it had been waiting for someone to touch it again. Claire carried it back to her car, intending to take photographs later, but curiosity overcame her. She sat on the front steps of the ruined cabin as the light thinned, flipping through the delicate, warped pages. Between verses and psalms, she found names scribbled in pencil and ink, entire generations carefully recorded in the margins. At first, it looked ordinary, births, marriages, deaths, until she noticed the repetition. The same first names appeared again and again, attached to new dates but familiar pairings. Then the family lines began to fold in on themselves. Brothers married nieces, cousins bore children with uncles, and daughters shared fathers with their mothers. Each page carried a deeper unease, as if the ink itself mourned what it recorded. Claire traced her finger along one entry dated 1949, where a name was scratched out violently, the paper torn through. The silence of the woods pressed in around her as the realization settled, this wasn't just a record of faith. It was a record of something the family had hidden for generations, a lineage that refused to end, looping endlessly within the same blood. Somewhere behind her, a branch snapped in the dark, and for a moment, it felt like the forest was remembering her, too. Claire spent the night at a roadside motel, unable to shake the unease that clung to her after reading the names inside the Bible. The following morning, under a cold gray sky, she spread the damp pages out on the motel's desk, trying to make sense of what she'd found. Each entry seemed deliberately preserved, yet there were smudges where words had been erased and rewritten, as if someone had tried to alter the truth. In the middle of the book, between brittle pages, she discovered a folded sheet of paper that hadn't been written in the same hand as the others. The ink was darker, the handwriting jagged, and it carried a faint scent of smoke. On it was a rough sketch of a family tree. But unlike the neatly drawn ones she'd seen before, this one spiraled downward, no clear branches, just looping names connected by arrows and circles, twisting in ways that made no sense. She noticed that some names were repeated 3 or 4 times, and the same surnames reappeared over generations, merging until it was impossible to tell who belonged to whom. A cold dread crept through her as she realized that this wasn't an error in record-keeping. It was intentional. Someone had mapped out relationships that blurred the line between family and obsession. The Harrow family hadn't simply intermarried out of isolation, they had preserved their bloodline deliberately, as though purity meant something sacred, or perhaps cursed, to them. The longer she studied it, the more disturbing details she uncovered. A name she hadn't noticed before was circled near the bottom of the page: Elsie Mae Harrow. A date followed, 1949. There was no father listed beside her, only a faint dash and a single word written beneath it: same. The meaning was unclear at first, but as she compared it to the rest of the entries, the truth formed slowly, like something terrible surfacing from the depths. The word same appeared in several other places, always in place of a father's name. Claire leaned back in her chair, her pulse quickening. This wasn't a simple genealogical curiosity, it was evidence of something far darker. The Bible wasn't just a record of birth and faith, it was a silent confession, a map of a family's descent into madness, where each generation folded into the next without ever letting anyone new in. As the wind howled outside her window, she could almost hear the trees whispering the names written in that book, and she knew the truth wasn't buried in history. It was still out there, breathing in the same woods where she had found the Bible, waiting for someone to follow the trail. When Claire returned to town, she began asking questions, hoping someone could shed light on the Harrow family. But the moment she mentioned their name, conversations went cold. The woman at the diner counter suddenly remembered another customer to serve, and the gas station attendant simply shook his head and muttered, "Best let them stay buried." Even the sheriff, a tired man with eyes that looked older than his face, refused to answer. He told her plainly that people who went looking for the Harrows didn't come back the same, if they came back at all. His tone wasn't threatening, it was warning, almost pitying. It wasn't just superstition that made the townsfolk silent, it was fear, heavy and lived in. The locals spoke in fragments, dropping hints without finishing sentences. A group of older men at the general store whispered that the family still owned the woods, even though the last recorded Harrow had died more than 50 years ago. They said the land didn't belong to anyone else because no one dared to claim it. Some swore that lights still flickered in the distance at night, deep between the pines, long after the cabin had fallen. Others said they'd heard crying, the kind that didn't sound quite human. There were stories of hunters finding animal carcasses arranged in strange symbols, and one man quietly told her that he'd seen a figure watching from the tree, lean, tall, thin, and barefoot, with pale skin that seemed to glow under the moonlight. Claire's curiosity deepened with every warning. She couldn't tell if the townspeople's fear was born from ghost stories or from something real, something still breathing in the dark. She spent hours in the county records office, digging through birth and death certificates, but half of the Harrow documents were missing, torn from their binders. The clerk avoided her eyes when she asked about it, insisting that the pages must have been damaged in a flood years ago. Still, she noticed faint outlines of removed staples, and the dust pattern showed the shape of missing sheets. Someone had taken those records deliberately. Late that evening, as she prepared to leave, a frail old man approached her outside the courthouse. His clothes smelled faintly of smoke and rain, and his voice trembled when he spoke. "If you found their book," he said, "you should burn it. They don't like being remembered." Then he turned away, disappearing into the fog that was rolling down from the hills. Claire stood frozen, clutching her coat tighter. For the first time, she felt it, the quiet awareness that something in those woods was still alive and watching, waiting for anyone foolish enough to call its name. Claire's search eventually led her to an old library on the edge of town, a place that smelled of dust and forgotten air. She spent hours combing through archived newspapers and faded microfilm reels, looking for any mention of the Harrow family. Most articles were mundane, obituaries, property transfers, a few small notices about farm auctions, but then she found one headline that froze her in place: *, local girl disappears in Harrow Woods, 1949. *, the name beneath it was one she already knew from the Bible, Elsie Mae Harrow. The article was short, printed in the back pages of the County Gazette, almost as if the editor wanted it forgotten. It mentioned that Elsie, age 16, had gone missing shortly after giving birth. Her father, Luther Harrow, claimed she had run away to live with relatives in Virginia, though no records ever confirmed that she had arrived. There was no follow-up story, no photograph, just a single column that ended mid-sentence. Claire printed the article and read it over and over, her mind racing. The family tree in the Bible had shown Elsie Mae connected by looping lines that made no sense, her father's name appearing twice, once beside her mother's and again beneath her own. The name of the child born that year had been scratched out, replaced with a faint mark that looked almost like a symbol. If Elsie had vanished after giving birth, what had happened to the baby? She began interviewing the oldest residents she could find, people who might still remember that year. Most refused to speak, but one woman, a frail 90-year-old who lived in a nursing home on the outskirts, finally agreed to talk. Her name was Mabel Crane, and when Claire mentioned Elsie May, her eyes filled with a haunted kind of recognition. Mabel spoke in a trembling whisper, saying that Elsie hadn't run away, she had been hidden. There were rumors that the father of her child wasn't some stranger from out of town, but her own half-brother, a man who had lived with the family in seclusion after the war. The town had known, Mabel said, but no one dared to confront Luther Harrow. Those who tried, she claimed, found dead animals nailed to their doors, or heard things scratching at their windows at night. Mabel leaned forward and told Claire that some believed Elsie never left the woods at all. They said the Harrows buried her somewhere near the family's root cellar, and that on quiet nights, the sound of a baby crying could still be heard echoing from beneath the ground. The diary appeared unexpectedly, like something that had been waiting for her to find it. Claire discovered it in a box of old donations at the library, tucked beneath a stack of hymnals and weathered school records. The leather cover was cracked, its pages yellowed and soft, but the name etched faintly on the inside front read Elsie May Harrow. Her pulse quickened as she turned the fragile pages, careful not to tear them. The handwriting was uneven, sometimes rushed, other times delicate, as if written in secret and fear. The entries began innocently enough, notes about chores, her father's temper, and the isolation of living in the woods. But as the months passed, the tone shifted. The words became fragmented, uncertain, full of dread. She wrote of being watched, of hearing footsteps outside her window long after everyone had gone to bed. One passage described a night when her half-brother, Daniel, returned from the hills after weeks away. She wrote about his silence, his eyes that looked empty as the cellar, and how her father seemed pleased by his return in a way that made her stomach turn. Later entries hinted at something unspoken between them, something that terrified her but that she couldn't escape. The pages grew more disjointed, thoughts scattered, words scratched out, entire lines blotted with tears or ink. Claire could almost feel the girl's panic bleeding through the paper. In one of the final entries, Elsie wrote about her belly growing, how her father told her it was God's will, and that no one must ever know who the child's father truly was. She mentioned being kept inside the house, curtains nailed shut, food left at her door. Her writing deteriorated as the months passed, letters trembling, sentences cut short. Then came a final entry, dated the night before her disappearance, *, he says the baby will save the bloodline. He says it's the same blood that runs in us all. But I dream of the woods calling my name. I think they know what he's done. *. The last page was torn halfway down, as if someone had ripped it out in anger or desperation. Claire stared at the final words for a long time, her chest tightening. The diary didn't just confirm the whispers, it gave them voice, one trembling line at a time. It was proof that Elsie had lived in fear, trapped by a family that believed purity was worth any price. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, and for a brief moment, Claire thought she heard a faint cry carried on the breeze, the echo of a secret that refused to stay buried. That night, the forest felt different. The air outside her cabin had turned heavy and still, pressing against the windows like a living thing. Claire tried to focus on her notes, but the edges of the diary kept drawing her eyes, as though Elsie's words were whispering in the silence. Every sound seemed amplified, the creak of the floorboards, the slow ticking of her clock, the faint rustle of leaves outside. Around midnight, the wind began to rise, carrying with it a low moan that wasn't quite natural. She told herself it was the trees, the old timbers of the cabin settling, anything but what it sounded like. But when she heard the first faint cry, soft and distant, it froze her blood. It wasn't the cry of an animal. It was the sound of a baby. Claire stood by the window, staring into the black woods. The flashlight beam barely cut through the mist, revealing nothing but shadows. Yet the crying continued, rising and falling like waves, pulling her toward the door. Against her better judgment, she stepped outside, her breath fogging in the cold air. The crying stopped the moment her feet touched the grass. The silence that followed was deeper than before, heavy enough to make her ears ring. Then came a sound behind her, slow, dragging footsteps across the porch boards. She spun around, but the doorway was empty. When she returned inside, the Bible she had left closed on the table was open, its pages fluttering though there was no draft. The open page showed the Harrow family names again, but something was different. A faint smudge had appeared beneath Elsie May's entry, like a new name forming beneath it in wet ink. Claire blinked and rubbed her eyes, but the mark was gone when she looked again. She told herself exhaustion was playing tricks on her. Still, when she tried to sleep, the whispering started. It wasn't words she could understand, just a low murmur, like several voices speaking from far away. By dawn, she hadn't slept. Her flashlight had died hours earlier, and the shadows in the corners of the cabin seemed to shift on their own. She could still hear faint noises outside, slow steps in the dirt, the crack of branches. When she finally gathered the courage to look again, she found small footprints in the mud just beyond the porch. They were too small for an adult, too large for a child, and they led into the forest, straight toward the ruins of the Harrow house. The next morning, Claire packed her things, ready to drive back to town and report what she'd found, but something kept her from leaving. It wasn't just curiosity anymore, it was a pull, a feeling that the woods themselves weren't finished with her. She decided to return to the ruins of the Harrow house, determined to see the cellar mentioned in Elsie's diary. The forest was darker that day, the trees crowding closer together, their branches woven tight enough to blot out most of the sun. Every few steps, she thought she heard movement behind her, the soft crunch of leaves that stopped whenever she turned around. When she finally reached the collapsed cabin, she noticed something she hadn't before, a trapdoor, half buried under fallen beams and moss. It took her nearly an hour to clear the debris, her hands trembling as the door creaked open, releasing a breath of air so cold it made her eyes water. Inside was a narrow set of stone steps leading into darkness. She descended slowly, her flashlight shaking in her grip. The walls were lined with jars of what looked like preserves, though most had rotted into black sludge. At the far end, she saw an old chest, covered in dust. When she opened it, she expected to find more relics, maybe letters, but instead, there were photographs, dozens of them, sepia-toned and brittle. Each photo showed members of the Harrow family at different times, standing stiffly beside the same cabin. Their faces were solemn, their eyes strangely vacant. One photo, however, stood out. It was newer than the rest, clearer, its edges less faded. It showed a young girl in a white dress standing beside a tall man whose hand rested on her shoulder. Their resemblance was unmistakable, same eyes, same narrow face, same pale hair. On the back, someone had written a date, *1949*. Claire's stomach turned as she realized she was looking at Elsie May and her half-brother, Daniel. Beneath the date, faintly written in pencil, were 3 words, asterisk, before the child. Asterisk. Her flashlight flickered, and for a moment, the reflection of the photoglass caught something behind her, a shape, tall and motionless. She turned quickly, but the cellar was empty. Still, she could feel the air shift, colder, heavier, as if someone else was breathing there with her. The photo trembled in her hands, though she wasn't sure if it was her shaking or something unseen moving the air. She stuffed the picture into her pocket and backed toward the stairs, her pulse pounding. When she climbed out into the light, the forest seemed to exhale, and for the first time, she wondered if she had just disturbed something that never wanted to be found. By the time Claire made it back to her cabin, dusk had already swallowed the forest. The air was thick with mist, and her flashlight beam barely cut through the gray. She felt watched the entire walk back, though she never saw anything move. Inside, she locked the door, shut the curtains, and laid the photograph on the table beside the Bible and diary. Her hands wouldn't stop trembling. The image of Elsie and Daniel burned behind her eyes, and that faint writing, before the child, echoed through her mind like a curse. She tried to convince herself she'd imagined the shadow in the cellar, but deep down she knew better. Something had been down there. Something still was. When she went to wash her hands, she noticed muddy streaks on the cabin floor. At first, she thought she'd tracked them in, but when she crouched down, she saw the prints were too large and too wide apart for her stride. Her stomach tightened as she followed the trail. They led from the front door straight to the table, stopping where she had set down the Bible. Her breath hitched, the book was open again, its pages fluttering softly as if caught in a breeze that didn't exist. Across the margin of one page, faint muddy fingerprints stained the edges, marking the line where Elsie's name appeared. Claire's heartbeat thundered in her ears. She slammed the book shut and turned toward the door, but froze. There were more footprints, outside, just beyond the window. She stepped closer and saw them press deep into the wet earth, circling the cabin. They weren't random, either, they formed a pattern, looping and overlapping until they looked almost like a spiral. She grabbed her camera, snapping photos through the glass, but the flash reflected something she hadn't noticed before, another print, smaller this time, right beside the larger ones. It looked like a child's. The wind outside rose suddenly, rattling the walls, and for a moment she thought she heard the faint sound of breathing on the other side of the door. Then came a slow knock, just once, soft and deliberate. She backed away, every nerve in her body screaming, but the knock didn't come again. Silence stretched on until even her own breathing sounded too loud. When she finally dared to open the door, there was no one there. Only the footprints leading away from the porch, back into the darkness between the trees. She wanted to run, to leave everything behind, but as she turned, she saw something new. The Bible lay open again on the floor, and this time, in the space beneath Elsie Mae's name, someone had written another, Claire Sutton. The night bled into morning without sleep. Claire sat in the corner of the cabin with her flashlight clutched in her hands, the Bible lying open on the floor where she had found her name written. The ink was faint, but unmistakably fresh. She tried to convince herself that fatigue or fear had warped her perception, that maybe the smudge of her own touch had created the illusion. But when she ran her fingers over the page, the ink smeared. Someone, or something, had written it while she was inside. Every instinct told her to leave. As dawn broke, she shoved her belongings into her bag, grabbed her car keys, and stepped outside, determined to get out of those woods for good. The air was eerily calm, too still for morning. Mist curled low along the ground, clinging to her legs as she walked toward her car. The forest seemed to watch her with the same quiet intensity it had the first day she arrived. She reached the car, unlocked the door, and froze. Every tire was slashed, the rubber shredded clean through as if by something sharp and deliberate. The driver's door was slightly open, and on the seat lay the family Bible. She knew she hadn't brought it with her, she had left it on the cabin floor. Now it rested neatly in the car, its pages open to the same family tree. Only now, the new name beneath Elsie's was clearer, darker, as if freshly written in her presence. Claire Sutton. Her pulse quickened as she stepped back, eyes darting to the woods. There was movement between the trees, faint, shifting shapes that never fully emerged. She thought she saw a figure standing among the fog, tall and still, its face hidden in shadow. Her instincts screamed to run, but the path behind her was just as thick with mist. She tried her phone, but the signal was gone, the screen flickering uselessly. A cold wind swept through the clearing, carrying with it the faint scent of rot and something sweet, like wilted flowers. It reminded her of the cellar air, heavy and wrong. When she turned back to the car, the pages of the Bible fluttered though there was no breeze. The ink seemed to spread, bleeding across the paper, connecting her name to the rest of the harrows. She stumbled back, realizing it wasn't just a record, it was a claim. The forest had accepted her, written her into the bloodline it refused to release. Behind her, a branch cracked, sharp and deliberate, like a footstep. Claire didn't look back. She ran, her breath ragged, the sound of rustling leaves following her, too close, too human, too familiar. Claire ran until her lungs burned, stumbling through mud and roots, her flashlight beam slicing across the endless maze of trees. Every direction looked the same, every shadow seemed to move. She couldn't tell how long she'd been running when she finally collapsed near a creek, gasping for air. The forest was silent again, unnaturally so, the kind of silence that pressed against her skull until even her heartbeat sounded too loud. She leaned against a tree, trying to steady her breathing, when something glinted in the water beside her, a small, rusted locket. It looked old, maybe decades. When she opened it, her trembling fingers revealed a faded photograph inside, a little girl with pale hair and eyes that mirrored her own. Beneath it, scratched into the metal, was a name that made her blood turn to ice, Claire May Harrow. For a long moment, she just stared at it, unable to comprehend what she was seeing. The name couldn't be real, couldn't be hers. But the resemblance in the photo was undeniable. The same features, the same slight scar near the eyebrow she'd had since childhood. Panic surged through her as she tried to rationalize it, maybe it was coincidence, maybe it was another girl. Yet deep down, a part of her understood. The Harrows had never disappeared. Their blood had simply thinned, passed down quietly through generations, changing names but not truly ending. Her own mother had been born not far from this very town, though she had never spoken of her family. The truth spread through Claire like a cold sickness. She hadn't stumbled upon the Harrows' legacy. She had come home to it. The woods seemed to react to her realization. The wind rose suddenly, bending the trees as whispers echoed between them, low, rhythmic, almost chanting. The ground beneath her felt alive, pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. In the distance, through the haze, she saw shapes moving between the trunks, outlines of figures, pale and slow, watching her with eyes that glimmered in the dark. They didn't advance, they simply waited, as if welcoming her back. Her flashlight flickered and died, plunging everything into shadow. The air grew colder, and somewhere among the whispering, she heard a voice, soft, female, and familiar. It spoke her name, not as a warning, but as recognition. When she turned toward the sound, the last thing she saw before the darkness swallowed her was her own reflection standing among them, smiling faintly, holding the old family Bible pressed against her chest.